Alright, time for part 2 of this little series. This time around I don't plan to rabbit on for quite as long as I did in the last video. That one took almost a week to edit and was a giant headache. Anyway, I want this video to cover two things. Firstly, I wanted to talk about the current Marine Corps specialization, which you'll notice I left absent in my previous video speculating about new units or customizations. And secondly, I wanted to talk about a new specialization. Now, the reason why I left the Marines absent in the last video was because they'd be related to this new specialization. And this new specialization is basically Marines, but taking into account Force Design 2030. I think they just call it Force Design now. The idea is kind of like a combination between the current Marine Corps specialization and maybe SOCOM? Or Striker Cav? The idea is that it's not quite as armor and vehicle heavy, but it would have more support, reconnaissance, and aircraft options to choose from. However, before getting into that, I want to cover the current Marine Corps specialization. And the reason why is because basically there's going to be a bit of unit shuffling between the two. Now, the reason why I'm shuffling units, even though I'm not a big fan of the concept, is to try and maintain the identity of the current Marine Corps specialization while also separating it from Fleet Marine Forces, which is just what I'm going to call it. You could call it Force Design 2030 or Marines 2030, but Fleet Marine Forces might be better because it's going to be using some elements from the Navy. Firstly, however, onto the current Marine Corps specialization. Now, when I talk about pulling units from the current Marine Corps specialization, there's two I'm primarily thinking of, the ACV and the F-35B. You can argue about pulling the Osprey as well. However, I think that's not strictly necessary, so I'm more inclined to just leave it where it is. That said, I don't just want to pull those two units out without replacement, which is what I'm basically going to go into here. Firstly, the replacement for the F-35B is pretty simple, and should be familiar to anyone who is following the development of the game. I'm specifically talking about the F-14D Tomcat. Granted, it's not in U.S. service anymore. It left service around the mid-2000s. However, that leaves it in good company with the Prowler, which also left service in the mid-2000s, and yet that's in the game, so I honestly don't see any big deal about it. I suppose the Tomcat could be used in a couple of ways. The first would be as your typical air superiority fighter, basically flying around with a pair of AIM-9s and half a dozen AIM-54 Phoenixes. Phoenixes? Is there a plural to Phoenix? Yeah, whatever. Stat-wise, the AIM-54 could be thought of as like a bridge between the AIM-120 and the AIM-174. The Phoenix has a pretty chunky warhead weighing at 133 pounds. For reference, the AIM-174 has 140-pound HE warhead. Meanwhile, the AIM-120 only has a 44-pound HE warhead. So, I wouldn't be surprised if the AIM-54 does 19 damage, the same as the AIM-174. Range-wise, I'm thinking maybe around 8 kilometers, to sort of bridge the gap between the AIM-120 at 7 kilometers and the AIM-174 at 9 kilometers. So the idea is basically as like a sort of budget AIM-174, except the Tomcat can carry half a dozen of these things. As for other ordnance, the two AIM-9s on the wing pylons would probably be a constant, much like the AIM-9s on the wingtips on the Hornet. As for other ordnance, I suppose you could probably carry bombs under the fuselage, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 pound bombs. If you can carry 4 of them, that'd be a pretty decent payload. What would be even more interesting is if you can carry guided bombs as well. The Tomcat D was capable of carrying laser-guided bombs, after all. As for other types of air-to-air missiles, the Tomcat, to my knowledge, couldn't actually carry the AIM-120, so maybe it would either be limited to the AIM-54 or just to the AIM-7. Although, if memory serves, the AIM-7 actually hits pretty hard in game. Just checked, the AIM-7 does 19 damage, the same as the AIM-174 or the R-37. Overall, that can make the Tomcat a surprisingly effective air-to-air platform. So maybe the centerline hardpoints could carry 4 AIM-7s, 4 AIM-54s, or 4 2,000-pound bombs. The two hardpoints outboard of the engine nacelles, which would have the launch rails for the AIM-9s, could either be used to carry each an AIM-54 or an AIM-7 or a drop tank or maybe another AIM-9 or possibly even more bombs. That leads us into the other potential use of the Tomcat as a ground attack platform. The Tomcat could carry JDAMs, it could carry laser-guided bombs, it could carry free-fall dumb bombs, and it could also carry cluster munitions. One thing that I'd be interested in finding out is whether or not the Tomcat could carry the Snake Eye retarded bombs. That can make the Tomcat a very interesting low-level, high-speed bomber, much the same way that people can use the F-18D or the F-16C with the right loadouts. And probably some Russian aircraft can be kitted out the same way, but if they can, I'm not familiar with it. The Tomcat could also carry, and I find this very interesting, 7 LAU-10 rocket pods. These are the 4-tube pods holding the Zuni rockets that you see on something like the AH-1 Super Cobra. It could carry 7 of them, for a total of 28 rockets. I know I'm Captain Obvious here, but that's a lot of rockets. Lastly, and I think I already mentioned this, you could probably mount a couple of drop tanks on the hardpoints outboard of the engine nacelles. Maybe you'll have the option of customizing the loadout for the fuselage hardpoints, kind of like the way the Su-57's weapon bays work. You have a forward weapon bay and an aft weapons bay. In this case, you have the forward set of hardpoints and then the aft set of hardpoints. So maybe you can go for a loadout like 2 AIM-9s, 2 AIM-7s, 2 AIM-54s, and then 2 drop tanks, which appears to be the usual quote-unquote fleet air defense loadout. The idea being that the 2 drop tanks are on the outboard nacelles, the 2 sidewinders are on the side range for the outboard hardpoints. The 2 sidewinders are on the side rails for the outboard hardpoints, and then you'd have 2 AIM-7s and 2 AIM-54s on the hardpoints onto the fuselage between the engine nacelles. One stat that I'd be really interested in would be the Tomcat's fuel capacity, basically how long it can loiter. If it's a small amount, like 2 minutes, then that's going to limit you. But if it's 3 or even 4 minutes, that could be a lot more interesting. Personally, I would lean more towards a higher fuel capacity at the cost of a, slightly more expensive aircraft. It's worth noting that the Tomcat also had 2 hardpoints directly under the engine nacelles, but for the life of me, I can't figure out what they were used for. Possibly for the extra 2 rocket pods, but I don't know. It'd be interesting to see if those hardpoints could even be used in game, and if so, what could be mounted on them. I mean, heck, maybe we can mount an extra pair of AIM-9s on them, for a total of 10 missiles. That'd be kind of fun. Or maybe you could use one of those hardpoints to mount a laser designator for the laser-guided bombs that the aircraft can carry. Maybe we'll have a customization option that allows us to choose between 2 Zuni pods, 2 AIM-9s, or a laser designator. Next, I want to touch on the ACV and its, for lack of a better word, replacement. I don't really like to use the word replacement because I don't see it so much as a replacement for the ACV as an alternative, for lack of a better word. It's not the same as the ACV, and I don't expect it to do the same job as the ACV is the point I'm trying to get at. Now, before starting with this, I kind of want to go to the AAVP. Although the actual name should technically only be AAV, because the P specifically refers to the personnel variant. The 2 others, granted the 2 others, the command and the recovery variant, aren't in the game. See my last video about my suggestion regarding recovery vehicles. Anyway, I digress. AAV stands for Assault Amphibious Vehicle. However, that wasn't the vehicle's original name. Its original name was the LVT-7, or LVTP-7, to denote the personnel transport variant specifically. Now, this name harkens back to the LVTs of World War II, the LVT-1 through 4. However, if there's an LVT-1 through 4, and an LVT-7, what about the LVT-5 and 6? And this brings me on to the LVT-5. This giant brick of a vehicle was developed in the 1950s as a large amphibious armored vehicle for the Marine Corps. There are several things that I think make this vehicle notable, the first of which being its troop carrying capability. This thing had a crew of 3 and the ability to carry 34 guys in the back. The AAVP can carry 1 squad of Marines and 1 fire support team. This thing can carry 2 squads of Marines and 1 fire support team. Or this thing could carry 2 Marine Raider squads and a Force Recon squad. If I'm not mistaken, this thing would have the second largest seating capacity in the game, only behind the Mi-26. I think this can make a very interesting addition and work well alongside the AAVP. And it's also amphibious, so it would synergize pretty well with the rest of what the Marine Corps does. As for customization options, I can think of a few. Firstly, you might have the option of installing things like slat armor, kind of like what you can do with the M113. Granted, I don't know of any historical reference of the vehicle actually being fitted with slat armor, but it would at least be an interesting option, I think. Also, for the sake of it, I would prefer, and granted this is just me, but I'd prefer if the vehicle retained its amphibious capability with the slat armor. Protection-wise, however, you're looking at something very similar to the slat armor on the M113 and its associated variants. As for firepower, you might start with a basic machine gun, or maybe even no weapon at all, but there are 2 potential upgrades which I think would be very interesting. The first would be the option of installing a small turret and a short-barrel 105mm howitzer. The stats for the 105mm HE shell would probably be similar to the 105 on the AC-130. And the reason why I say that is because that is the only 105mm HE shell I can find in the game. All the other 105s either shoot, well, all the other 105s shoot HESH. The 105 on the Stryker MGS, the M60, the M8, or the Booker all shoot HESH. I can't even find 105mm heat, which I suppose would be another alternative ammunition option, because you're certainly not going to be able to fire Sabo out of such a short-barreled gun. That said, having 105mm HE and 105mm heat might not be a bad option for what is mainly supposed to be a fire support vehicle to support infantry. That said, this thing wouldn't be the most heavily armored thing in the world, and you probably don't want it to get shot at for very long, or get shot at all that much. Ideally, you don't want to get shot at all. The weapons range would probably be maybe 1200 meters, although with such a short-barreled gun system, I can actually see an argument for dropping that down to something like 1100. The second armament option that I think would be pretty interesting would be to take the twin 40mm anti-aircraft gun mount off of an M42 Duster and mount it on the LVT-5. Now, there was one prototype like this made, however, I can't find a picture of it. Stat-wise, the 40mm would probably be similar to the 40mm gun on the AC-130. I suspect that a configuration like this would be particularly useful against light armor vehicles or exposed infantry, but wouldn't have the same punch as the 105mm. As for weapon range, you'd probably end up seeing something like 1000 meters against ground targets, and 1.3 to 1.4 against air targets, both helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, and both low and high altitude. Nothing quite as crazy as the Drivatsania, the vehicle in Guard's tank battalion that has the 57mm autocannon with the stupid 1900 meter range. You're probably not going to see something like that, but still 1.3, 1.4 kilometers against air targets. Overall, I think that could be a particularly interesting addition and would cover for the absence of the ACV-30. Alternatively, if you want to dip into the hypothetical, you could literally just mount a Sheridan's turret onto the vehicle chassis. However, again, that's hypothetical. Another thing I wanted to mention would be a new vehicle. That would be the LAV-AG, or assault gun. Alternatively known as the LAV-105, this basically involved taking a 105mm gun in a turret and mounting it on the LAV chassis. Functionally, this would basically be like a Marine Corps version of the Stryker MGS. However, because it's based off the LAV chassis, it would also include a lot of the features of the LAV chassis, including the add-on armor upgrade package, which isn't nearly as good as the SRAT that the Strykers get, but would still allow the vehicle to both be airdropped and to swim. And that, I think, would be very interesting. There is, to my knowledge, no fire support vehicle like this that can swim in the game. I think the closest you would probably get would be something like the Sprut, but there's certainly nothing like this for the US. And I think it could be very interesting to add something like this. That said, it would also suffer from many of the limitations that the Stryker MGS suffers from. It wouldn't be particularly heavily armored, and it wouldn't have a whole lot of ammunition. The ammunition capacity for the 105 potentially being as low as 8 rounds. Although I wouldn't be surprised if that figure gets doubled or even tripled for the sake of gameplay. Anyway, that about covers everything I have for the current Marine Corps specialization. The only other thing I could think of would be basically taking the AAV, removing the turret with the 50 cal and the Mark 19, dropping the price down by about 5 or 10 points and giving it its original 50 caliber turret, and then giving it an upgrade option to upgrade to the twin 50 cal Mark 19 turret. However, that might be a bit needless. Sure, the vehicle would be a bit cheaper, but would it be necessary? I'm not sure it would add anything of any real substance. Although, before I go, another thing I can think of to give to the current Marine Corps specialization would be to have an option for the assaultmen to give them the anti-armor version of the SRAW. I've heard some people talking about this, and I vaguely remember it being in the February 2024 beta, although I could be wrong about that. However, I don't remember anything about it myself. The original version of the SRAW, the FGM-172A, if memory serves, was actually a top attack system. Potentially, if they were to basically add the anti-armor version of the SRAW back, they could... the basic small version is 70 points. The SRAW version is 90 points. So maybe you would have 100, 110, 120 points for the anti-armor version. As for how it would work, potentially it would work something like the regular SRAW, but it would be top attack. It would have the same damage, same pen, everything like that, but it would be top attack. I think that could be rather interesting, and it would give the current Marine Corps specialization another anti-armor arrow in their quiver. In that way, I suppose it could act very similar to the Ranger Moz teams in the SOCOM specialization. After all, it would only take about 2 or 3 rockets to kill pretty much anything, not counting any that would be intercepted by APS. Of course, the downside is that it's only a 600-meter range, again much like Moz. Anyway, on to the second half of this video, and the Fleet Marine Forces specialization. The idea behind this specialization is basically as a sort of leaner version of the Marine Corps. Maybe something like a combination between Marines and SOCOM. Compared to the current Marine Corps specialization, what I'm thinking is something that again, is kind of like SOCOM or maybe Stryker Cav. As for the point allotment, I think it would be kind of nice if it would have the exact same point allotment as the current Marine Corps specialization, but that probably wouldn't work. As it currently stands, I don't think you'd have a whole lot of vehicle points. In fact, you may not have any vehicle points. But you would have more support points, more recon points, and maybe more infantry points as well. You might, keyword might, also be lacking in helicopter points, but I'm not sure. I'm going to err on the side of caution and say that you would still have around 750 helicopter points. As for the equipping of this specialization, I'm going to pull at least some things from the post that the developers of Broken Arrow made on Steam a couple years back talking about the Marine Corps Specialization. I'm going to pull some of the units from that. Not everything, but some. Firstly, I want to start with the Air tab, mainly because I think this is going to be the easiest one to actually fill out. The core of it would be FA-18 variants, specifically the FA-18E, the FA-18F, and the EA-18G. The role that these would fill would basically be the same as the FA-18C, D, and the Prowler, respectively. The main difference would be that these are slightly more expensive, but also slightly more capable versions of the previous aircraft. So the FA-18E can carry basically the same weapons load as the FA-18C, except it has 2 more hardpoints and maybe a slightly greater weapons load, and thus a slightly greater weapons load. Whereas the FA-18C, for example, can carry 2 AIM-9s, 2 AIM-120s, and 4 AIM-174s, the FA-18E would be able to carry 2 AIM-9s, 4 AIM-120s, and 4 AIM-174s. The FA-18F would have a weapons load very similar to the FA-18D, including with things like smart bombs. But you could also include other options such as Stormbreakers, the JSO, or maybe increase the number of pylons that can hold the SLAM ER from 2 to 4. Alternatively, you could give it the JASM, or its navalized variant, the AGM-58C LRASM, or Long Range Anti-Ship Missile. This might be a slightly cheaper, slightly less capable version of the JASM. Compared to the JASM, the warhead weight is the same. They both have a 1,000-pound HE warhead, but the range on the LRASM is lower. Maybe you'd have the option between choosing the longer range SLAM ER or the harder hitting LRASM. As for the EA-18G, this would probably be something akin to the F-16CJ, in that you could carry either more harms, or ECM pods, or fuel tanks, but you'd still also have a relatively small weapons load with maybe a couple AIM-9s and a couple of AIM-120s. But those 3 aircraft would basically form the core of the Air tab. Other aircraft options could include the F-35B and the F-35C. Functionally, the F-35C would only differ from the F-35A in-game in that it does not have the GAU-22A, the 4-barrel 25mm rotary cannon that the F-35A has. And the F-35B just wouldn't change at all. Neither the F-35B or the F-35C have an internal gun. However, and this could be an interesting upgrade option, from my understanding there was a plan to give them a stealthy gun pod to contain the GAU-22 in, that had 220 rounds of ammunition compared to the 180, I think 185 that the F-35A has. That would probably be, it would probably be something like the gun pods on the Harriers, so maybe an extra 10 points. I still don't expect it to be super useful, but it could at least be an interesting option. The weapons loadout would be basically the same as the current F-35s. Now, you might wonder why you would have both the F-35B and the F-35C in a single specialization instead of just leaving the B variant in the current Marine Corps specialization. And the reason why I've done this is because it allows you more flexibility. Say you want to kit out the F-35B with things like JSOs and use it as a cluster, or you use it to drop cluster munitions, but you can also kit the F-35C out with laser-guided bombs. Alternatively, you can kit the F-35C out with 6 AMRAAMs as a quasi-air superiority fighter, but kit the F-35B out as a strike platform. The idea is that you have flexibility in that you have multiple stealth aircraft which you can kit out in different ways. The problem with the F-35B being the only stealth aircraft in the Marine Corps specialization is that you have to choose, do I want to kit it out one way or do I want to kit it out the other way? You have more freedom here if you have 2 stealth aircraft. Granted, I understand that that's kind of the point, is that you have limited options, so your choices matter more if you only have one stealth aircraft. But I think it would be more interesting to have two, mainly to see what players could do with it. Lastly, you could give the air tab maybe yet another C-130 variant. However, if you want to give the Marine Corps some transport capability, I would recommend giving them the C-2 Greyhound. This is used by the Navy, and it is basically a small twin prop transport plane. Think of something relatively similar to the AN-72 in the Coastal Troop Specialization. It would have roughly the same cargo capacity and maybe slightly less seating capacity. The idea, again, is mainly as like a light transport aircraft. Alternatively, you could take the KC-130J from the current Marine Corps Specialization and remove it in and put it in Fleet Marine Forces, and then put the C-2 Greyhound in the current Marine Corps Specialization. However, I don't really see a need for that, and besides, the KC-130J is actually used by the Marine Corps, while the C-2 Greyhound is used by the Navy, not the Marines. And this is the Fleet Marine Forces Specialization, combining both the Navy and the Marines. Thus, the Super Hornet variants, which I'd like to point out the Marines don't use, and the F-35C, which the Marines... Well, actually, no, I think the Marines use the F-35C. I think they have a small number of F-35Cs in service, or at least they want to have a small number of F-35Cs in service. Anyway, I would personally prefer going with something like the C-2 Greyhound as a light transport plane. I think that could be kind of interesting. A light and relatively cheap transport plane. As for the helicopter tab, I think things could get a little bit interesting here. The problem is that I can't find any good option for an attack helicopter or something akin to it. However, I think I might have found a way around that. Overall, however, the number of helicopters would be pretty small. The first thing would probably be the CMV-22B. This is basically a navalized version of the Osprey. The idea here is that the Navy wants to use it to replace the C-2 Greyhound onboard aircraft carriers as a carrier onboard delivery aircraft. Basically, again, the small transport plane idea. It's very similar to the MV-22, but it's not the specific Marine Corps variant. This is why I was comfortable leaving the MV-22 in the current Marine Corps Specialization, is because you can just use this. I suppose it could differ from the current version, or the current the MV-22, the Osprey for the Marines. I suppose it could differ from that by not having the minigun in the upgrade for the minigun. Is what I'm trying to get at, and failing miserably. Aside from that, it would be very similar to the Osprey in the Marine Corps Specializations, or even the Osprey in the SOCOM Specialization. Another thing you could do is you could potentially move the CH-53K to the Fleet Marine Forces Specialization and replace it with the CH-46E Sea Knight, which is, from my understanding of the CH-46, it's like a sort of quasi-navalized version of the CH-47 Chinook. Okay, after having done a little bit of research, the Chinook is basically a heavier, enlarged version of the CH-47, the Chinook, is basically a heavier, enlarged version of the CH-46. So, like a slightly mini Chinook in place of the CH-53K. However, honestly, I don't really want to do that. I prefer to just leave the K in the current Marine Corps Specialization. The downside is that you don't have any big, heavy lift transport helicopters. Unless you want to try and put the CH-46E in the Fleet Marine Forces Specialization, which I suppose would be an option, but it would be a bit archaic compared to everything else in there. That's not to say it wouldn't work, and the CH-46 was operated by the Navy, but you could potentially argue that it would be out of place. Lastly, you would have two more helicopters based off the SH-60, which is basically a navalized version of the Black Hawk. These two helicopters would fit slightly different roles, and they would be, in a way, more like... You could kind of think of them as different degrees of the MH-60 DAP. The first would be the MH-60R. This can be thought of as your conventional quote-unquote transport helicopter. Much like the Black Hawk, it could have a carrying capacity of maybe 13 guys, but it would have two hardpoints, one on each side, that could carry light weapons, like maybe an M230 or a 50 caliber gun pod or some rockets, be it either Hydras or Daggers, or maybe ATGMs. Now, granted, there is a bit of a precedent for this in game, because a number of Russian helicopters can carry things like gun pods or rocket pods, so this wouldn't be too unusual. It would be a bit of a departure for US helicopters, though. The next variant would be the MH-60S. You could probably differentiate between these two variants by calling the MH-60R the Seahawk and the MH-60S the Nighthawk. The Nighthawk could be thought of as a more advanced version of the Seahawk. Instead of being able to carry 13 guys, you might only be able to carry 8 or 9, much like the UH-1Y. But like the DAP, you would have 4 hardpoints instead of 2, with the ability to carry anything from M230s, gun pods, ATGMs, rockets, possibly Stingers. The primary difference between the two would be how many weapons that you can carry. For example, if you want to carry Hellfires on the Seahawk, you might be limited only to the twin launcher. But if you want to carry them on the Nighthawk, you would have access to the quad launcher. And like other Black Hawk variants, you would have the option of swapping out. You would have the option of customizing different door guns, either ranging from the M240, the minigun, and the GAU-21. Maybe the GAU-19B, but probably not. The primary difference, not really difference, but the idea behind this is that they act like transport helicopters, but they're also armed. So you can use them as quasi-attack helicopters in the same way that you can use the DAP or a variety of Russian helicopters. That said, it is still a bit of a band-aid fix for not having a dedicated attack helicopter. Lastly, one thing you could add would be the MH-53E Sea Dragon. This is basically a mine countermeasure version of the CH-53E in the current Marine Corps Specialization. I'm a little bit hesitant to mention it because I'm not even sure if it's in US Navy service anymore, but it would be the only available option that I could think of for a heavy lift transport helicopter to fit in this specialization. Now, I'm going to jump around a bit and move on to the infantry. And the reason why I'm doing this is mainly because I honestly don't know how the infantry would be set up. It may be similar to the way the infantry is set up in the current Marine Corps Specialization. You would probably have large 13-man squads like you do in the current Marine Corps Specialization, and you may very well have CAT teams as well. However, exactly what these squads would be equipped with would be a little bit more interesting, mainly because I'm not entirely sure. However, I can at least take a few cues from Force Design 2030. It appears, at least according to Force Design 2030, which is in fact just named Force Design, they've apparently dropped the 2030. It was renamed in October 2023. The squad, a 13-man squad of Marines, would be given a Maz. They would also be given some underbarrel grenade launchers, but I don't know how many. However, the thing that I think is most interesting would be the rifles in which they are equipped with. You're probably going to have an option similar to what you get with Airborne in that you can upgrade the rifles, is what I mean. First, they'd start out with the M27 IAR, what they currently have. But you might have the option of upgrading their rifles to the M7 Spear, much like what the Airborne NGWS squads get. Or rather, the NGWS upgrade option for Airborne, the same M7 rifle. One thing I don't know is if they're going to have things like the M250 light machine gun. I can't find anything where it says they will, so I'm going to assume that they aren't. Another alternative to this would basically be like a sort of reverse reserve Marines. The idea is that, what I mean here is that instead of taking the regular Marine Corps or the regular Marine squad and downgrading, quote unquote, them to the reserve Marines, you could upgrade them. So the regular Marine squad might have AT4s, they might have IARs and things like that. But when you upgrade them to give them M7s, that's when they get the MAWs. Personally, I'd prefer to just give them the MAWs outright and then upgrade them or give them the option of getting the M7 as a separate upgrade. Another thing that the squad of Marines are supposed to be given is a missile, for lack of a better word, called organic precision fires. A squad of 13 Marines is supposed to have one or two of these. If I'm going to be entirely honest, I have no idea what this looks like, much less what it's going to be capable of. An alternative would be something akin maybe to like a javelin, like the way troopers are set up in the Striker Cav specialization, in that you have a couple of AT4s and a javelin with two missiles. You might have something similar here. You have a Maz with maybe 3 or 4 shots, and then two of these OPF missiles that would maybe be something like a javelin. However, the biggest problem here is that I just don't simply know exactly how these infantry squads would be kitted out. I also don't know how they would be named to differentiate them from the current Marine units, or the current Marine infantry squads. As for transports, this is where things could get a little bit more interesting. Obviously, the ACV would be coming back. However, another transport that could be used alongside it would be the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, or EFV. This is basically a tracked vehicle with a 30mm autocannon and a coaxial 7.62mm machine gun. It would have relatively light ballistic protection, probably something on par with the ACV, but one interesting feature that it could have would be at a particularly high water speed, maybe around 45 kilometers instead of the current 20, which seems to be the across-the-board water speed that everything else has, even for vehicles that couldn't actually reach 20 kilometers in water in reality. This would be a troop carrier that could carry apparently 17 people, which is an interesting figure because that would imply either a full squad of Marines plus an extra 4 seats. So I'm not entirely sure what that could mean, for lack of a better term. However, if the infantry tab, or if the infantry squads could be divided into only 4, that might be interesting. It is worth noting that in the Steam post that the developers released a few years ago, where they talk about the Marines, the Dragon team was only supposed to be 4 men, as was the Small and the SRAW teams. That's kind of interesting, I think. And you might be able to apply a similar idea here. Another vehicle that they could use would be the JLTV, and there are several variants of the JLTV to choose from. Your basic variant is probably might have either... Well, your basic variant would probably be not all that different from the Humvee. In reality, the JLTV is basically supposed to be a replacement for the Humvee. The biggest difference is that the JLTV is designed from the ground up to be armored, kind of like an MRAP, compared to the Humvee, which isn't. Granted, the Humvee wasn't designed to be used in combat in the first place. It was designed to be used mainly as a utility, logistics, and transport vehicle, and wasn't ever supposed to be shot at in the first place. It's a bit of a bugbear of mine that people call the Humvee bad because it wasn't very heavily armored when it wasn't designed to go into combat in the first place. So your basic transport version of JLTV might be able to carry 13 guys and then have a 50 cal or Crows, or either it would have a open manned mount or a Crows and could accept things ranging from maybe an M240, a 50 cal Mark 19, and maybe even a minigun too. As for vehicle customization options, there's a few that I can think of. The first one would basically be like a mesh or slat armor for the JLTV, kind of like what's on the MATV. And this wouldn't just apply to the infantry transport version of the JLTV, it would apply to all JLTV variants. As for the ACV, I'm not sure what you could do with that, short of maybe giving it proper slat armor or giving it an active protection system. Yes, an APS would be fictional, but it would be a decent upgrade to the vehicle's survivability. As for firepower, I'm honestly not sure what to do with it. One alternative would be to remove the current 30mm gun turret and give it the same kind of 30mm RWS that you see on the Striker RV or the AMPV so you can mount a Javelin. Aside from that, though, and that would also be fictional, but aside from that, though, I'm not sure what. Again, I'm not sure what you can do with it. And that just leaves the EFE. Now, because the EFE never entered service, any customization options for it would be purely hypothetical. I suppose you could try and give it applique armor. There was some consideration to making an applique armor kit for it that could be installed after it reached the beach, but before it would meet anything like landmines or IEDs. But I don't know how far along that got, or whether or not that was practical in the first place. Again, you can make an argument for something like an APS, although I'm not entirely sure how that would work. Alternatively, you could just go for some proper ERA along the sides and front, and then basically treat it kind of like the BT-3F, in that, well, yes, it has ERA, but it can still swim. As for customization options for weaponry, I'm honestly not sure what you can do. The vehicle has a proper turret rather than an RWS, so it's not like you could just pull one off and slap another one on. It could be a bit bottlenecked in that respect. As for vehicles, you honestly wouldn't have many. The only thing I could think of to put in the vehicle tab would be a JLTV with a tow missile in the back. And like, what do you do with that? Do you just allocate 250 points in the vehicle tab just to have something in the vehicle tab? Do you leave it empty? Honestly, I don't know, but with only one thing to put in the vehicle tab, it seems kind of pointless to even have points in the vehicle tab to begin with. Unless they want to create like a hypothetical fire support variant of the ACV by plonking the Striker MGS's turret on it, or maybe something like the MPF's turret, but eh? Although, one way you could tackle the vehicle tab thing is to basically have no points in the vehicle tab, much like the motorized infantry specialization, and give the option of mounting a tow to the bog standard infantry carrier version of the JLTV. The idea is that you'd have the option of mounting it on the bog standard JLTV, like you can mount an M240, an M2 Browning, a Mark 19, maybe a minigun, and you would have an option between tow 2A and tow 2B. Or you could even have three options: tow 2A, tow 2B, and tow BB, all at different point costs. And this would be kind of like the motorized infantry specialization. You don't have any vehicles with the motorized infantry specialization, but because you can put different versions of the same vehicle in a deck under the infantry tab, like what you can do with Strikers, then you're theoretically not missing out on anything. As an aside, and I suppose this would apply to this specialization a lot because this is at least in part about the Navy as well. But I've seen a lot of people suggest things like boats. If I'm going to be entirely honest, I don't really see boats being something that could be added to the game. At least not easily. And when I say boats, I'm talking about like riverine attack craft, things like Zodiacs or Ribs, maybe Swick boats, things like that. And I understand why people want these in the game, but just look at the way all the maps are designed. Hardly any of them have any appreciable amount of water on them. The maps are designed primarily for ground vehicle combat. So you would basically need to design entirely new maps in order to accommodate boats. And then, aside from just making the units and balancing them with and figuring all those stats, you then basically need to rework the entire deck building structure one way or the other. Either, well, firstly, you're pretty much going to need a new category of unit, unless you want to fold them under vehicle, which I suppose you could do, but that might be a little bit sloppy, for lack of a better term, instead of just giving them their own individual category. Then you're either going to need to up the amount of points per specialization and thus up the total amount of points per deck to accommodate the addition of boats, or you're going to have to adjust the price of pretty much everything in order to work around the fact that you have this entirely new vehicle that players are going to be incentivized to bring along because of the new maps. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying that as things currently stand, it wouldn't make much sense and it wouldn't be of very much use. And if you do add maps with a large amount of water to it, you're not necessarily, well, you're not just incentivizing the use of boats, but you're also going to incentivize the use of things that can swim. So what you're probably going to see, and this goes into balance issues, you're probably going to see the marine specialization, like the original one, and this one theoretically, get very popular, and you're probably going to start seeing the balance shift in Russia's favor because just of the sheer number of vehicles that they have in their various specializations that can swim. As an aside, on the subject of swimming, one thing you could do to potentially curtail that is to basically define what you mean by swimming or amphibious, because there's two types of amphibious. There is basically what I'm going to call ocean amphibious, and then there's what I'm going to call riverine amphibious. Vehicles, like a vast majority of the Russian ones, are riverine amphibious. They can cross a river, but they're not going to be driving off of a landing ship and then putting their way to shore. Some vehicles are ocean amphibious. Things like the AAVP, the ACV, the BMP3F, the BT3F. Those are ocean amphibious, and so those would be able to go in the deep, quote-unquote, waters, or areas where, like, for example, if you do have a map with a bunch of islands, then any large gap between the islands, only ocean amphibious vehicles would be able to swim that gap. But smaller gaps or just rivers, then pretty much anything could swim it. I suppose it's one way you could balance it, but in the end, it would be a whole lot of work for something that is proportionally not that big of an addition to the game. I don't really see that being added, mainly because that would be completely fictional. Although, I suppose... Here's the thing about video games. You don't need to be tied to reality. So if you want to add something that is fictional, as long as you don't go crazy with it, I don't really see the downside to it. I think it would be kind of interesting if they did that. But that's just me. As for support, this is where I think things could get a bit interesting, mainly because you'd have several options, but also because of things that you wouldn't have. If you want long-range fire support, one option you would have would basically be Nemesis. This is a JLTV chassis that has been stripped down. Technically it's a UGV, from my understanding, but it has been stripped down, and in its place there's a pair of boxes for cruise missiles for the Naval Strike Missile, which, if memory serves, yes, it is the Joint Strike Missile that the F-35A can carry, and possibly the F-35C as well, is a derivative of the Naval Strike Missile, so you're probably looking at something similar to that. Either something just like that, or with a reduced range to reflect that it's been ground-launched instead of air-launched. That, possibly serving as a sort of cheap cruise missile launcher, could be potentially interesting. For air defense, another option you would have would be the Metis. Now, there's actually two variants of the Metis, from my understanding. There's the first variant, which has the 30mm autocannon and a pair of stingers, and then there's a second variant, which also has the 30mm autocannon, doesn't come with stingers, but comes with a radar system. Potentially, you might be able to combine the two. So you have the variant with stingers, or say you have a sort of Frankenstein Matus that has both the stingers and the radar. Think of something like an ultralight version of the Striker M-SHORAD that only has 2, maybe 4 stingers on hand instead of 8, but would also come with the 30mm and the radar. Alternatively, you can treat the radar like an upgrade onto the Matus platform, basically like the Matus Mark I without the radar, and then the Matus Mark II with the radar, while still keeping the stingers for the Matus Mark II. Aside from that, however, I'm not sure what other kind of air defense systems you would have. I suppose, again, if you want to get hypothetical, you could basically take an ACV chassis and then mount a NASAMS box launcher on the back to create something Slam Ram-esque out of that, but again, that would be hypothetical. The only alternative I can think of, and I think this would be pretty interesting, would be the Typhon system. Now, to be fair, the Typhon system, to my knowledge, is not used by the Marine Corps. However, especially if you're not going to give the Marine Corps HIMARS, and you might be able to do that, I'll get onto that in a second, giving them the Typhon system would be another interesting alternative. Now, the Typhon system, basically what the Typhon system is it is a semi, or rather it's like a militarized semi-trailer with a 4-cell vertical launch system that can fold from horizontal, which is how it's basically stowed when you're moving, to vertical. And these are effectively no different than the vertical launch or than the VLS cells on an Arleigh Burke class guided missile destroyer. And they can house either Tomahawk cruise missiles or SM-6 surface-to-air missiles. The SM-6, for reference, is basically what the AIM-174 is based off of. The AIM-174 is an RAM-174 that's had the Mark 72 rocket booster knocked off and then has been placed on and then has been bolted to the hardpoint of an aircraft. The Standard Missile 6, otherwise known as the RAM-174, is the ship-launched version of that. Now, the way I see it is you could potentially take the Typhon system and use it in 2 ways. The first would be something akin to the A222 Bereg, I think it's pronounced, from the Coastal Troop Specialization. You can either treat it like a dedicated cruise missile launcher with 4 Tomahawks, a dedicated SAM, or basically half and half with 2 SAMs and 2 Tomahawks. However, personally, I would prefer if you just split them up into 2 separate vehicles. You would have a Typhon launcher with 4 Tomahawks, which would be pretty expensive, maybe around 300 points. And then you'd also have another Typhon launcher with 4 surface-to-air missiles, 4 SM-6s, that may only be around 250 points. But the stats for these missiles would be basically, they would be akin to the stats that you see on an Arleigh Burke. The most notable of which being the range of the surface-to-air missile version, which would have a base range of 4,500 meters, and then you add the extra range on from radar, either the 2 times extra range at high altitude or the 1.25 times extra range at low altitude. As for damage, even though the AIM-174 only does 19 damage, and I think the version fired off the Arleigh Burke also only does 19, I would be willing to see the damage up to 21. Now, you can make an argument that this doesn't fit with the AIM-174 and potentially doesn't fit with the versions fired off of the Arleigh Burke in game. However, after what they did with the Slam Ram in the latest update 1.0.11, it's apparent that they're willing to change the stats of a missile for one use compared to a missile for another use. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that there is a precedent for different systems that ostensibly use the same missile to have different stats for those missiles. And if you have the Typhon system, this would be a big SAM that has, again, a 4,500 meter range base that does 21 damage, kind of like the PAC-2 Patriot. Also, for the sake of it, I do realize that the Typhon system doesn't have a radar. In fact, if I'm going to be entirely honest, I do not know whether or not the. Here's the thing, the SM-6 has a secondary surface to surface attack capability. The Typhon system, to my knowledge, is primarily intended as a surface to surface weapon system, using cruise missiles to attack things on the ground. The SM-6, again, does have that capability. However, I'm not entirely sure why you would go with an SM-6 over just having a Tomahawk. The only advantage I could think of that the SM-6 has is that it's faster, much faster than a Tomahawk. Now, if you wanted to make a cruise missile version of the Typhon launcher, you can choose between a Tomahawk and an SM-6. Maybe the difference between the two is that the Tomahawk has a much bigger boom on the other end, but the SM-6 is just going to rip in towards the target and be very hard to intercept. That said, I can't find any evidence whatsoever that the Typhon launcher is going to be used in a surface-to-air capacity. However, this doesn't necessarily matter for the game because it's a game. It doesn't need to completely adhere to reality. And if you want to give the Typhon launcher the ability to fire surface-to-air missiles, do it, as far as I'm concerned. And if you want to give it a radar system as well, again, do it. Think about it. There's a bunch of SAM systems in the game that are supposed to be paired with radars that do not actually have the radar. All the Patriot variants, the MML, the pretty much any of the S300 variants. And yes, I do include the S300 V4. I realize that when the S300 V4 with the 4 missiles sets up, there is a radar that folds upwards. This is not the entire radar. The S300 V4 system, otherwise known as the RNE 2500, I believe, was supposed to use several different radars. That radar is only one of that several, and the entire system cannot operate just on that radar. As for other things like the little antenna that pops up on the slam ram, I have no idea what that is, but it's far too small to be the radar. Or the little mast thing that pops up on the S350 when it sets up. Again, I don't know what that is, but it's far too small to be the radar. The only vehicles in the game that actually have proper radar systems would be things like the M-Shoreheads, be it either the Striker M-Shorehead or the M6 M-Shorehead, the C-Ram, the Tunguska, the Tor, Book, and even then, I'm not sure Book can operate solely on the radar, or solely with the radar on the TELAR, Transporter Erector Launcher and Radar, compared to a TEL or Transporter Erector Launcher. Oh, and there's also, again, the Pantsir variants, the Tor variants, things like that. But a number of the surface-to-air missile systems, particularly the big ones, do not have the radars which they're supposed to be used. So, sure, the Typhon system doesn't have a radar, but so what? And secondly, there is potentially precedent that you could use the Typhon system in a surface-to-air capability in real life. That precedent's called IBCS. IBCS, which stands for Integrated Battle Command System, if I'm not mistaken, basically is a program that the U.S. Army has started where any system that can see a threat can cue any other system to engage it. For example, if an F-35 is flying around and using the F-35's radar spots a pair of incoming cruise missiles, the F-35 can basically talk to a Patriot battery. That Patriot battery can fire a pair of interceptors, even though the Patriot battery cannot see the target. In fact, the Patriot battery's radar may be off completely, but it fires a pair of interceptors. The F-35, for all intents and purposes, grabs, quote unquote, those interceptors and is able to guide those interceptors onto the incoming cruise missiles. And if you think that example sounds a bit outlandish, the US Army did just that in 2019. The only difference is that instead of actual cruise missiles, we're talking about a pair of target drones. But they used an F-35 to guide in a pair of Patriot interceptors to destroy the target drones that the Patriot battery itself could not see. That being said, it is not entirely out of the question that a radar system, be it either a Patriot radar, an airborne radar from an F-35, or maybe an AWACS, a sea-based radar like Spy 1 or Spy 6, wouldn't be able to grab an SM-6 off of a Typhon launcher and use that against an airborne target. I don't know if that's what the Army wants to do, but it's a possibility. So the idea of using the Typhon launcher as a surface-to-air missile platform is not entirely out of the question, even in real life. As a follow-on to the Typhon system discussion, 3 things to note. Firstly, while the Marine Corps doesn't actually operate the system, in late August they did conduct operational training with one in Japan. Secondly, the SM-6 appears to be used in the Typhon system primarily in an anti-ship missile role, and it does have that capability in real life. However, theoretically, there's nothing stopping it from being used as a surface-to-air missile, which is what it was primarily designed to do, and what it primarily does. Thirdly, and most interesting, the Army seems to be toying with the idea of launching a PAC-3 from the Typhon system. Specifically, they're looking at the ability to fire a PAC-3 MSE from the Typhon system. Now, you cannot quad pack a PAC-3 MSE into a single Mark 41 VLS cell. The missile is just too large. But you can quad pack PAC-3s into a Mark 41 VLS cell. Not the PAC-3 MSE variant, just the regular PAC-3s. So, potentially, you could have multiple upgrade options here for a SAM variant of the Typhon system. You could have a PAC-3 MSC upgrade, which would probably be the cheapest, but you'd only have 4 missiles. And then you'd have a PAC-3 upgrade, which would have shorter range missiles, but you'd have 16 of them. Or you could have the SM-6 as a long range missile. On top of that, one thing you could do is split the Typhon launcher into 2 groups of 2 cells. So you can take, say, 2 SM-6s and 8 PAC-3s, if you want. Another option you would have for air defense would basically be Iron Dome. Now, in reality, the Army operates Iron Dome. The Marine Corps does not. But the Marine Corps may end up buying the system in the future, particularly if they want a small, relatively easily mobile system to protect small islands against things like cruise missiles and drones. It would probably operate similar to the MML with Stingers, but you would have more of them. The Iron Dome, which would probably be represented by its launcher, would have 20 missiles, and the kind of missile that it shoots is interesting. It's called, assuming I can pronounce it correctly, the Tamir. I probably butchered that. Anyway, it's called the Tamir. And the thing that's interesting about this missile is that it's very, very cheap. The Iron Dome system is basically designed to shoot down incredibly cheap homemade rockets that might cost only a couple $100s per. The problem is that interceptors are not cheap. They can't be by definition. Like, the job that they're supposed to do, you can't really do something like that with something that is cheap. The Tamir is a bit of an exception. It only costs between $50,000 to $100,000. And yes, I mean only. Even a basic Stinger costs 6 figures. Now, this is not going to solve the shot exchange problem by any means, but it is going to at least help take the edge off. The Tamir in-game might be something similar to a Stinger, but maybe with a Sidewinder's range. So, Stinger damage, but with a Sidewinder's range and the ability to shoot down cruise missiles, which is something that the Stinger lacks. Potentially, as a way of making up for the low damage per missile, the system could fire 3 or even 4 missiles per target. On that subject, I don't know if the game's logic is smart enough to know whether or not it should fire more missiles at a target. Like, for example, a cruise missiles don't appear to have health, per se, so anything that hits them is going to shoot them down. But a cruise missile, a helicopter has health. So, is the game's logic smart enough to know that I can't kill that with 1 missile, so it fires multiple missiles, but also is able to tell I can kill that with 1 missile and only fires 1 missile? I don't know. Finally, one more option you might have for the support tab would be HIMARS. Well, kind of. It's a bit of a gripe of mine that the Marines don't get access to HIMARS, and since the developers don't seem particularly keen on the idea of letting Specializations share units, they probably never will. However, to remedy that, I present Robo-HIMARS, otherwise known as the AML. For all intents and purposes, this is just a HIMARS that's been turned into a UGV. It's worth noting that while it appears that the system was ultimately supposed to be equipped with 2 pods, the prototype that was tested was only equipped with the standard HIMARS pod. That would probably be the version that would make it in the game, mainly for simplicity's sake. We know that version exists after all, and we would have a pretty good idea of what it can carry and what it can do. Lastly, we have the Recon tab, and if I'm going to be entirely honest, I've put off talking about this one mainly because I'm not entirely sure about it. The problem is that I've only found one infantry squad or one infantry unit that you could put in here, and that would be the SEALs. Now, the SEALs, as it is described in the post that the developers made back a few years ago, was basically as a 4-man team with a variety of weapons and the ability to swim. Now, this makes sense as a counterpart to the PDSS in the Coastal Troop Specialization. However, that's only one infantry unit, and I'm not entirely sure if that would... Well, I mean, I suppose it's not without precedent. There's actually a number of specializations that only have one type of recon infantry. There's Cav scouts in the Armor Brigade. There's scouts and Striker Cav. There's probably 1 or 2 in the Russians. I'm not familiar enough with them. There's the airborne snipers, and just checked, there's the Diversentki, or however you pronounce it, in the motorized infantry specialization. So I guess only having one infantry squad in the recon tab wouldn't necessarily be unusual. As for exactly how the SEALs would be configured, I'm not entirely sure. I suppose you could make them a 4-man squad, but if you want to up them to 6 or 8-man, that might be more interesting, especially if you want to try and diversify the kind of weapons that they have. Alternatively, I suppose you could maybe split it up into 2 infantry units, maybe like SEALs and then maybe SWIC. Then again, SWIC is less SEALs, like, they don't... SWIC's job is basically to get SEALs in and SEALs out. They aren't necessarily special forces in their own right. However, having a SWIC infantry unit could be kind of interesting, I suppose. I'm just not entirely sure how it would be used, unless you want to consider it like good, quote-unquote, infantry, high-quality infantry. Alternatively, you could make SWIC as defensive, quote-unquote, infantry in the Recon tab. That could be interesting, but I'm not entirely sure how it would work. As for the SEALs themselves, you could split them up into a couple of different units. For example, if you want SEAL snipers, a small 2 or 3-man sniper team, and then you might have a larger 4 or 6-man team that you can be more proactive with. And depending on what loadout you choose, they could have flashbangs. Alternatively, you can split the SEALs up across tabs. For example, you might have a small 2 or 3-man sniper team and a 4 or 6-man general recon infantry team in the Recon tab, and then you could potentially have a larger SEAL team in the infantry tab that would serve the same basic role as something like Delta Force or Marine Raiders. As an aside, I vaguely remember seeing a reference to a Marine Reconnaissance Regiment, or something akin to that. However, I haven't been able to find information about that, so I don't know how a unit like that would be set up or how it could be translated as recon infantry in-game, if it exists at all. However, aside from the infantry, one thing that I think would make the Recon tab very interesting would be the vehicles in it. The first option you would have would basically be a recon version of the JLTV. This would be kind of like the MATV in SOCOM, except, well, it would be more like a combination between the MATV and maybe the GMV Flyer, in that you would have an RWS, but you could potentially mount up to a 30mm autocannon to it. But, unlike the MATV, Well, aside from the 30mm autocannon, unlike the MATV, you would not have a sniper. So I think that could be an interesting option. Another option would be the M1161 Growler. This is basically a tiny truck. Think of it as something akin to the IFAV. The main difference being that the IFAV was just a modified civilian truck, and that the Growler is a slightly more purpose-built platform that was primarily intended for use, or primarily intended to fit inside of a V-22 Osprey. There was also the Boeing Phantom Badger, which was pretty much designed to do the exact same thing. Either one of those could be used as a light IFAV-style reconnaissance vehicle without a troop-carrying capability, or as a light infantry transport with maybe 3 or 4 seats. Another ground vehicle that could be used would be the ARV, or Advanced Reconnaissance Vehicle. Near as I can tell, this is a program to try and develop a replacement for the LAV-25. There are currently several prototypes, some 6-wheeled, others 8-wheeled. The BAE prototype looks very similar to the current ACV, while the Textron prototype basically looks like a shortened ACV with only 6 wheels. What's notable is that the vehicle is supposed to be equipped with a 30mm autocannon, much like the ACV-30. Or rather, the ACV with the 30mm autocannon is known as the ACV-30. But it's supposed to be equipped with a 30mm autocannon like the ACV. This could be used as a reconnaissance vehicle in much the same vein as, for example, the Striker RV. As for whether or not this thing would come with a lazy designator, I honestly don't know. Interestingly enough, the ARV may also come with an active protection system. Apparently the Marine Corps is looking at that as well. The next category of things to talk about in the Recon tab would be drones, and here I think you'd have a few interesting options. For starters, you might have something like the RQ-21 Blackjack. This is intended as a successor to the RQ-7 over in Striker Cav, and would basically serve the same role as a light, low-altitude, small, and cheap UAV. Another option highlighted in the Steam post would be the MQ-4C Triton. This is basically a navalized version of the Global Hawk. Now, I think you might be able to do some interesting stuff with this one. Now, one of the changes made to the base Global Hawk design to make the Triton was the ability for basically to allow the drone to change altitude relatively quickly. The idea is that the drone would be flying really high up above the clouds normally, but if you want to investigate a ship, you could drop down below the cloud layer and physically look at the ship. This could be translated in-game as the drone having the ability to fly at low altitude. Combined with a very large view range, this could be potentially a very advantageous asset. Exactly what that view range would be, I don't know. Nor do I know how that view range would be affected by the drone actually flying at low altitude. I don't expect it to have the same view range as a Global Hawk, so it might only have the same view range as something like a MQ-1C or an MQ-9, with a ground view range of 4,500 meters. Alternatively, if they do end up buffing the Global Hawk's view range back up to its November 2024 beta values, which was 6,500 meters, then you would give this thing a 5,500 meter view range. That said, I wouldn't be surprised if the view range goes down if the drone actually flies at low altitude. Another thing worth considering is that all of the changes to make the MQ-4C reduced the overall range of the drone. This might be translated in-game as the drone having less loiter time. Alternatively, you could scrap the idea of allowing the drone to change altitude and just have it as a slightly cheaper version of the Global Hawk with a slightly lower loiter time. Lastly, in the Recon tab, one interesting option would be the MQ-4 Fire Scout. The MQ-4C Fire Scout? I'm not sure which. Basically, the idea is a drone helicopter. So think of something kind of like a cross between the OH-58 and the RQ-7. Alternatively, you can make an argument that this would also go in the helicopter tab, but it's listed in the Recon tab in the Steam post that the developers made about the Marine Corps Specialization a few years back, which I am referencing from here. The idea would basically be as a reconnaissance UAV helicopter. However, much like the OH-58, you would likely be able to arm it either with hellfires or daggers or maybe with machine gun and possibly stingers. I think that could be an interesting thing to see in the game, particularly if it's put in the recon tab. Lastly, before I forget, again, for logistics, you'd probably have two options. You would have the cargo version or utility version of the JLTV, which, if memory serves, can carry around 2 metric tons of supplies. And then apparently the Advanced Reconnaissance Vehicle is also supposed to have a logistics version, much like the LAVL. I don't know the carrying capacity of that, but that could also be added and be interesting. Overall, I think that would make a pretty solid foundation for a specialization. There are still things that need to be worked out, like the infantry, or whether or not there's actually going to be anything in the vehicle tab. I'd like to point out that there was also supposed to be an ATGM version of the ARV, but it seems kind of redundant to have an ATM version of that, which would presumably be like the LAVAT, and an ATM version of the JLTV, which would be basically like an up-armored version of the tow-equipped Humvee. Anyway, that's what I have for that specialization. Okay, I wasn't expecting to make this today. So, quick recap. The first half of this video, just talking about the Fleet Marine Forces specialization, was supposed to come out today. The second half, talking about this next specialization, the one I'm about to talk about, the light infantry specialization, that was supposed to come out next week, the 22nd specifically. And then my video talking about the Russian specialization was supposed to come out the week after, on the 29th. However, today, the developers released a post on the Discord, and I suspect on Steam as well, but I honestly haven't checked, basically saying that they're going to reveal the roadmap and the future plans for the game on the 25th. And I wanted to get all of these videos out before they did that. So I'm going to have to tack this part talking about the second U.S. specialization idea, or talking about the second idea I had for U.S. specialization onto this video, and then cover the Russian specialization in its own video. Which isn't that big of a deal, in all honesty, although this might be a Sunday release. Anyway, I digress. On to the specialization. This one is just called Light Infantry. As the name implies, it's about light infantry. You could probably give it a better name later, but I'm just going to call it Light Infantry. Although it's not entirely supposed to be about light infantry, it's also going to be about artillery and support, along with having either good quality infantry or relatively cheap infantry. Now, unfortunately, because this is a bit rushed and impromptu, I haven't had the opportunity to do as much research as I would have liked, particularly into the infantry, but I can't really help it at this point. It's probably not going to be that big of a deal anyway, but still. As for how the specialization is going to be made up, aside from the before-mentioned focus on infantry and support, you're probably going to have a decent amount of recon, but not much else. You're not going to have too many vehicle points. You're not going to have too many helicopter points, and you might not have any air points whatsoever. You might not. I don't know. I'm leaning towards yes, but I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, starting with the infantry, because that's kind of what this specialization is about, you're probably looking at a number of 9-man squads. The infantry setup is probably going to be similar to something in like the motorized infantry or mechanized infantry, where you have multiple larger squads that can also be that are dedicated towards roles like AT, AA, or that have things like machine guns, ATGM launchers, or manpads. For example, you might have a basic 9-man infantry squad, and this squad's probably going to be kitted out roughly like Airborne is. That is Airborne without the M7 and the M250 and the Maws. So we're talking like basic M4s, M249s, AT4s, and a few underbarrel grenade launchers. And then you might have another 9-man squad, which is kind of like the Troopers AA, but you have maybe 2-man pads and a couple of M240s. And that trend can continue. An AT squad, for example, might have, well, I mean, there's different things that you can choose from. You might have 2 tow launchers, for example. The idea of having 2 ATGM launchers isn't necessarily unusual, and I'm not just talking about the weapons squad. If memory serves, I think it's the VDV Cornet team that has 2 launchers. So you could have something like that, and the option of switching between the tow 2A and the tow 2B. Or you might have something kind of like the weapons squad with a pair of javelins, but they have M2 Brownings in place of the M240s. Or you might have something like a fire support squad, which has maybe 2 M2 Brownings and 2 Mark 19s in it. Now, if I'm going to be entirely honest, I don't know if this is how U.S. infantry is organized in reality, but I'm just trying to give examples of how the infantry could be set up. Personally, I would go with a basic squad that's slightly cheaper, regular M4s, M249s, M203s, and some AT4s, and then a man-pad squad with a pair of Stingers and a pair of M240s, but otherwise similar to the regular squad, and then an AT squad with maybe a pair of tows or possibly javelins, whichever, and then a pair of M2 Brownings. And then maybe you might have a fire support squad with a javelin, a 50 cal, and a Mark 19. And there wouldn't really be anything stopping you from giving each of these squads a customization option to give them M7s, M320s, and M250s in place of the M4s, M203s, and M249s respectively. Or maybe swap out the M240s for the MG338s. Unfortunately, I'd also like to recommend things like combat engineers, but I think combat engineers have been taken by Striker Cav. I suppose you could just call them engineers and have them do the same job. It'd be a little bit on the nose, but I guess would work. As for good infantry like Raiders, Delta, or SSO, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Unless you want to have something relatively generic, just like Army Special Forces in 9-man teams that have good stats. But again, that would be a bit generic. And there's probably 1 or 2 other types of squad that you can have here. For example, if you want something similar to the Mountaineers in the Russian Coastal Troops Specialization, I don't know how to pronounce them, and I'm not even going to try, you could get something like I believe it's the 10th Mountain Division. I believe it's them that specialize in mountain warfare, and like their Russian counterparts, they would have longer range weapons. You would think that the Mountain Division in the name would give it away, but that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes a division will keep a name even if the role changes. So a division that used to be a mountain division or used to be an airborne division would keep the name even if they're just a standard infantry division. As for the type of transports that you would have to move the infantry around, you could have a few options. The first one of note would be the tracked striker. The idea is basically a striker chassis but with tracks instead of wheels. This was developed in the 2010s as part of a competition to replace the M113, a competition that the AMPV, or rather what would become the AMPV, ultimately won. The customization options available would be pretty straightforward, I would think, and roughly in line with what you have in the Striker ICV, with things like add-on armor, possibly with an active protection system on top, and a Crows with an M2 Browning or a Mark 19, maybe a 30mm autocannon, and a Crow's Javelin with the M2 Browning or Mark 19 options. Overall, it wouldn't be anything too crazy, but I do think this tracked striker as a concept is actually pretty interesting. Another option you might have would be something like the V150. Granted, this is kind of old, but it wouldn't be the only thing in this specialization that would be a bit dated. The idea is basically an amphibious 4-wheeled vehicle with a turret that starts out with maybe something like an M2 Browning or Mark 19, but you can potentially upgrade it to something like a 20mm. Like the track striker, it would be able to carry 9 guys. Next, keeping with the V series, there's the V300. This is a 6-wheeled vehicle that could carry 9 guys, but was also armed with a 90mm gun and a small turret. Now, because the BMP-3 exists, the idea of an IFV having a single-shot large-caliber gun instead of an autocannon isn't all that unusual. However, I have found reference to the possibility of removing the 90mm gun turret and replacing it with a turret that sounds very similar to the one mounted on the Bradley, at least in function if not form. Specifically, there appears to be an option to mount a turret with a 25mm autocannon and a twin tow launcher. This could serve as a decently heavily armed, but lightly armored IFV. Lastly, you could have an MRAP option like the Cougar HE. This is basically a larger 3-axle version of the Cougar H MRAP, which might appear in the Recon tab. The idea here is as a transport vehicle that is actually decently heavily armored, at least against things like small arms, that you can also add slat armor onto for that bit extra protection. I mean, it still doesn't have amazing protection. If it gets hit with an ATGM or a tank round, it's going to get blown wide open, but it would be decently tough for something that would be also pretty quick. The armament, however, might be limited to a Crows with an M2 Browning or a Mark 19, so it's a decently heavily armored vehicle, and it's decently fast, but you don't really want to use it as the tip of your armored spearhead or anything like that. As for vehicles, there's a few that you could choose from, but you really wouldn't have too many options in this category. I'm going to suggest several, but I don't expect all of them to make it into the specialization. Firstly would be something called the V300 TUA. This, as near as I could tell, is basically just a V300 chassis, but with the Hammerhead twin tow launcher from the M901 or the LAV-AT mounted on top. This could act as a light ATGM vehicle for the specialization. Secondly, there's also the V600. This is, for all intents and purposes, a slightly enlarged V300 chassis. It's still 6-wheeled, but it would have a 105mm gun and a turret roughly similar to that of the M8 AGS, I think, although I'm pretty sure it didn't have an autoloader. Firepower-wise, you're not likely to see anything particularly impressive. The gun would likely be very similar to the one on the Striker MGS, although one upside is that you might have more ammunition. Next is something called the Expeditionary Tank. This was developed for a program that would ultimately produce the M8 AGS. The idea behind this thing is basically as a light fire support vehicle with 105mm gun. It's a tracked platform, it's not very heavily armored, and the main gun is a 105, very similar to the one on the Striker MGS. In fact, the turret from the Expeditionary tank was taken, put on an LAV chassis, and entered as part of the interim armored vehicle program, which ultimately became the Striker MGS. Although I think the autoloader is different between the two vehicles. The Expeditionary tank was supposed to be airdroppable, or at least LAPS droppable, so that could introduce some interesting synergy with, again, other specializations. There was supposed to be some, or at least one add-on armor kit. I don't know if this would have removed the ability to airdrop it, but that could be a trade-off in-game. Even if, personally, I would just rather pay the extra points to get the add-on armor and still be able to airdrop it, rather than lose the ability to airdrop it for a free, for lack of a better term, armor package. Overall, nothing particularly complicated here. It would basically be another version of the M8 AGS. Next, we have something that I think could be pretty interesting. Specifically, the M60. Or rather, well, the M60A3 and an upgrade, or customization option. The M60A3 would be very similar to the M60A1 in the Marine specialization. In fact, I honestly don't know if there would be a meaningful difference between the two. However, things get interesting when you get to the customization options. Because aside from the ability potentially to add extra ERA, like I mentioned in my previous video, and you may or may not have an option for an upgraded engine like you do in the M60, you would, like with the M60, have an alternate vehicle configuration. except instead of something like the M728, you would have the M60A2. Now, the M60A2, oftentimes nicknamed Starship, was basically it was an M60 chassis or hull with a new turret that mounted the 152 millimeter gun launcher that the Sheridan uses. And this could fire all the same kinds of ordnance that the Sheridan's gun launcher could fire, including Shillelagh ATGMs. So basically, you would have an option between a 105mm direct fire gun or a larger, slower firing 152mm gun with ATGMs. The 105 would likely be similar to, again, what you see on the M60A1 and the Marine Corps Specialization. Meanwhile, the 152mm gun launcher would be very similar to what you get on the Sheridan, at least assuming that you took the Shillelagh option. So maybe if you want to tackle armor, you might prefer the 105. But if you want to tackle things like infantry or lightly armored vehicles, you would prefer something like the 152. And yes, I say that even though the 152 does have an ATGM, the 105 would arguably be better against armored vehicles because you have a faster reaction time, and the 105mm Sabo is traveling a lot faster than the Shillelagh. The last vehicle I'm going to suggest is the XM803. This is a downgraded version of the MBT-70. After the Germans left the program in the late 1960s, the US continued toying with the prototypes, first developing the T803 and then the XM803. Now, I don't know if the XM803 was an upgraded version of the T803 or if it was just the T803 being redesignated as XM803. The vehicle was armed with a 152mm gun launcher. This would be similar to the one on the Sheridan and the M60A2. However, it was supposed to have a longer range. Apparently, one issue with the gun launcher on the Sheridan was that the maximum range of a conventional shell fired out of the gun launcher was shorter than the minimum range of the Shillelagh. So there was this anti-sweet spot where if an opponent was sitting, you couldn't hit them with either. The gun launcher on the MBT-70 was supposed to rectify that problem by just using a longer ranged gun. With that in mind, the gun would probably have a longer range than the Sheridan. For example, if the Sheridan has a range of 1,200 meters with a conventional shell and 1,500 meters with a Shillelagh, which, if memory serves, those are the range figures, the XM803 might have something like 1,300 or 1,400 meters with a conventional shell and then 1,600 meters with a Shillelagh, possibly 1,800. For the Shillelagh on the XM803, you might consider upping the pen from 600 up to about 750. Much like with the M60 mentioned before, you would have the option of swapping the armament out. In this case, swapping out the gun launcher with a conventional 120mm tank gun. In this configuration, you'd have something very similar to the Abrams. Ammunition-wise, you might be looking at something similar to the FEP, with high explosive instead of heat or HESH, and then a decent Sabo. I don't know exactly what kind of Sabo you could use, but you could potentially make an argument for giving it the A4 Sabo to try and compensate for the fact that the vehicle itself wouldn't be all that heavily armored. The MBT-70, and subsequently the XM803, did not contain the variety of composites that later vehicles like the Leopard 2, the Abrams, or most modern main battle tanks have. The armor, if memory serves, was basically comprised of 2 layers of regular steel with a notable air gap in between. That air gap acting to provide some extra protection against shaped charge threats like ATGMs. As a result, the vehicle's armor protection might be similar to the M60A1 in the Marine Corps Specialization as it is now, with, say, 300mm of kinetic protection in the front and then 500mm of heat protection in the front as a base. ERA could be another upgrade option, something that you could slather on the sides and maybe the front to try and give it some extra protection, but still, you're not going to be getting into close quarters barroom brawls with T-14s in this thing, at least if you know it's good for you. Lastly, you could probably give the thing an active protection system as a customization option as well. This might interact with the ERA upgrades in much the same way that the active protection system on the SEP V2 or SEP V3 interacts with the Tusk kits. Anyway, those are the vehicles that I could see being in the specialization. If I was going to pick from that list what to put in the Specializations vehicle tab, I think I would choose the V300 TUA, the V600, the M60, and the XM803, which are probably called the M803 in game. And I'm thinking that you would only have about 4 V300s and V600s, and only 2 M60s and M803s. The idea isn't so much that you don't have many vehicles to choose from, but you don't have them in large numbers. So you would still have some vehicle options, but the overall point value of the vehicle tab wouldn't be all that high. Next, we have artillery, and this is where the specialization gets really interesting. With one exception that I'll mention towards the end, you would not have any rocket-based artillery systems. It would all be tube artillery. And there's 4 primary systems that I'm thinking of. The first option would be the M108. This is an interesting little vehicle because it basically involves taking an M109 chassis, ripping the 155mm gun out, and then sticking a 105mm gun in. So, for all intents and purposes, imagine one of the M109s from the Armor Brigade specialization, but with the same artillery piece as the Hawkeye MWS. On the upside, I suppose, you wouldn't run out of ammunition easily. You certainly have enough space inside the vehicle for a lot of it, although I actually can't find concrete ammunition figures. In-game, this thing would probably be treated much like the Hawkeye MWS, in that you could get a relatively large number of them. Customization-wise, you'd probably have an option for an add-on armor package like slat armor, and an option between conventional HE or cluster rounds, or potentially extended range. I expect the performance of the 105mm gun on this thing to be very similar to the 105 on the Hawkeye MWS. Alternatively, you could give it the option of mounting the 105 from the Striker SPH, but I'm not really sure if that would fit with it too well, seeing as it's basically supposed to be a small, relatively cheap, and numerous light SPG. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you would have the XM2001 Crusader. For all intents and purposes, this would be a lot like a US version of the Koalitzia. And I specify the Koalitzia specifically and not the M1299 because the system would not have the same capabilities as the M1299, specifically range. I'm thinking of something more in the same range bracket as the Koalitzia rather than the Iron Thunder. The Crusader would be a rather conventional, if advanced, 155 artillery piece. It would have a decent stock of ammunition, an automatic loading mechanism, and thus relatively high rate of fire, a decent range, and pretty good accuracy. Customization-wise, you might have the usual, quote-unquote, options of giving it an add-on armor package, and choosing between picking either conventional HE or cluster ammunition. I suppose you could have an extended range option in there as well. Again, like the Koalitzia. Of course, by that point, the system's starting to get pretty expensive, maybe somewhere in the 200 to 225 point range. Now, these next 2 options would be really interesting. The first would be the M107, and the second would be the M110. The M107 was a long-barreled 175mm, or 6.9 inch, gun system that was designed primarily to achieve a very long range. In-game, you're probably looking at a range of about 4,300 meters to about 4,500 meters. And because you're firing a 6.9 inch shell compared to a 6 inch or 6.1 inch shell, you still have a pretty solid boom at the other end. For something that is in effect a mini 2S7, you'd have a lot of capabilities of it, long range and a decent boom. Of course, you'd also have a lot of the drawbacks. The ammunition capacity is relatively low. The system isn't very heavily armored. It is a giant exposed gun, after all. And it wouldn't be the most accurate thing in the world, nor would it have a particularly fast rate of fire. And then there's the M110. Now, this used the same chassis as the M107, but instead it mounted a relatively short barrel 8-inch howitzer. This might have a shorter range of 3.8 or even 3.5 kilometers in its A1 version. However, there was also an A2 version that mounted a longer barrel, and you might get something like 4.3 kilometers out of it. And because you're firing an 8-inch shell, you will most definitely have a nice boom on the other end. Of course, the downsides with the M110 would be pretty much the same as with the M107. It's not particularly accurate, it doesn't fire particularly fast, it doesn't have a whole lot of ammunition on board, and it's not the most durable system on the planet. That said, when you're dropping 6.9-inch shells or 8-inch shells on your opponent, I don't think they're really going to care much about those drawbacks. They're just going to care about why the sky has become metal and death. Moving on to air defenses, you would have a few options here, but you'd also have a noticeable deficiency. The vast majority of the air defense systems available would be mounted on the M548 chassis. Now, normally I wouldn't really want to do this. I would much prefer either giving them to the Armor Brigade Specialization, because that's where the M548 currently is, or moving the M548 here. However, I can't think of another alternative to replace the M548 in the Armor Brigade Specialization if you were to move it. As for the air defense systems themselves, one thing that you could get would be the MIM-72 Chaparral. This is basically an M548 with the cargo bed cleared out, and then a launcher for 4 AIM-9 Sidewinders has been installed. Originally, this was supposed to be used alongside the PVADs. Overall, you're not really looking at an especially complex system, and I don't expect it to be all that expensive either. You might be able to add on some extra armor as a customization option, but I'm not really sure how. Another customization option might be to remove the Sidewinder launcher and basically replace it with the turret from the Avenger, but I'm also not entirely sure how that would work, mainly because they have two separate armaments. Instead of having 4 Sidewinders, you would now basically have 8 Stingers and an extra 50 cal, and I'm not entirely sure that would be worth it. But that could act as a pretty decent, if somewhat basic, SHORAD system. Meanwhile, the only HIMAD system that would be available in the specialization would be the M727 mobile launcher for the MIM-23 Hawk. Now, Hawk would be an interesting system just due to its age, if nothing else. Firstly, if it was added to the game, it would be one of only 2 US SAMs that are semi-active guided, the other being the PAC-2 Patriot. However, with a pretty meaty warhead, ranging from 119 pounds to 163 pounds depending on variant, you're going to be doing a lot of damage if you hit. 19, maybe even 21 damage. Range-wise, you're probably looking at something like 3 to 3.2 kilometers. The launch would have 3 missiles. Again, they would hit kind of hard, but semi-active guidance means that they're probably not going to be as reliable as more modern systems like Patriot. Overall, you can think of it kind of like an American version of the Book M2. However, compared to the Book M2, you'd likely be able to field more launchers, 4, possibly even 6. Of course, this is at the downside of having fewer missiles per launcher, but on the upside, the system would probably be less expensive, maybe only around 125 to 135 points each. So each individual system may not be all that capable, but you would have enough of them that you could either spread them out or group them together in groups of 2 or 3. As for upgrades for the Hawk, there were a few that could be considered. Firstly, there was the Sparrow Hawk, which was basically supposed to replace the Hawk itself with the AIM-7 Sparrow in an 8-missile launcher. Now, I can't help but wonder if this is the same 8-missile launcher as used on warships, but I honestly have no idea. Another interesting option was basically to try and mate the Hawk system with the AIM-120 AMRAAM. This was kind of like NASAMS, and if I'm not mistaken, it ultimately evolved into what would become NASAMS. You could make either of those customization options for the M727, but honestly, I'm more inclined to just stick with the basic Hawk, particularly if you have the option of putting a large number of them in your deck. Another option for an air defense vehicle that the specialization could have would be to take an M548 and then mount a quad 50 caliber mount with honestly what appears to be an M45 from World War II in the bed. This was apparently done in Vietnam. Of course, since we're talking about a 50 caliber mount, this would arguably only be effective against helicopters and not fixed-wing aircraft. That said, if you can pull it off, it still could be pretty interesting. And because we are talking about 450 caliber machine guns, it's going to do a number on enemy infantry. You might have the option, and granted this would be fictional, to replace the quad 50 cal mount with something like a twin 40mm mount from an M42 Duster to try and give it that extra range and hitting power. Or maybe you might even have the option of mounting a Phalanx Seawiz to it, but I think that's more wishful thinking than anything else. Overall, this is supposed to be a relatively light and cheap vehicle that would be effective against aircraft to a degree, but would also be useful against things like ground targets. Another air defense option could be the T-249 Vigilante. In short, this is basically a PVADS, but hopped up on some of the strongest, most illegal roids that you could find. It uses an M113 chassis, but instead of having a 6-barrel 20mm rotary cannon, this thing has a 6-barrel 37mm rotary cannon. It could fire 3,000 rounds per minute, and each one of these rounds is 1.5 inches in diameter. So basically, imagine everything that the PVADs can do, this thing could do just as well, if not better. It would probably have a slightly longer range. It would most certainly do more damage. You probably wouldn't have quite as much ammunition available as the PVADs, and I would assume it would have radar, so you would be able to shoot down missiles. I can't think of much in the way of customization options here, except for maybe potentially some add-on armor somehow, and I guess you could try and jury-rig a Stinger pod to it, but you probably don't need it. Lastly, for air defense, you could have something like the M247 Sergeant York. This is basically a radar-directed gun mount mounted on a tank chassis that was equipped with a pair of 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns. The original chassis used was an M60, but I believe it was supposed to be mounted to an M1 Abrams. Customization-wise, if you're going to put it on an Abrams chassis, you could up-armor it with something kind of like Tusk. You could even go so far as to put an active protection system on it. Alternatively, you could also try and mount a Stinger pod or two to it to give it that extra bit of anti-aircraft firepower. So that could be rather interesting as a bit of an expensive SHORAD system, kind of like the Tunguska. Detouring from air defense, there's one system that I want to cover that I think could be rather fun, and that's also pretty obscure. So everyone knows what the TOS is, and a lot of people probably know, or at least people who play the game, know of the American equivalent, the CATFE, on the AAVP chassis. However, what would you do if I told you that there was something even crazier than the CATFE? For reference, the CATFE, just so we're all on the same page here, is a system that fires 21 giant thermobaric rockets at the target. It was originally designed to clear minefields, kind of like a Miklik, but it's basically used in game to depopulate city blocks. Well, there is something even crazier than that. It's called the XM130 Souffle. SLUFAE. I believe it stands for Surface Launch Unit Fuel Air Explosive. This is basically a, once again, M548 chassis that had a launcher for 30 of these rockets, 30 of these rockets mounted in the back. This is a bit nuts. The system was tested in the 1970s and apparently didn't go anywhere. Remember, this is a mine clearing system, instead of something that's supposed to be used against enemy forces like the TOS is. That said, it was actually built and could be a pretty fun addition to the game. As an aside, if I'm going to be entirely honest, I kind of wish the devs would buff the CATFE, and by extension the Souffle, I suppose, just upping the range from 1,200 meters to something like 1,500 meters. I think that could go a long way to try and make the CATFEs more user-friendly, or at least more forgiving to use. Anyway, I digress. I also have a slight confession to make. The last two things I named, the Sergeant York and the Souffle, I had originally wanted to suggest them for the Armor Brigade specialization, but I completely forgot about them when I made the last video. So I'm suggesting them here. You can either put them in this specialization or you can put them in Armor Brigade. Personally, I'm more inclined to Armor Brigade, particularly the Souffle, because if you pair that thing with the Assault Breacher, and then you take an Armored SOCOM deck, you will basically dominate urban environments. Finally, rounding out the support tab would be logistics, and honestly, there wouldn't be anything special here. You would probably have two different trucks for logistic purposes, a 2.5-ton truck and a 5-ton truck. A prime example of which would probably be things like the M939 as a basic transport vehicle. Basically something that could both move troops and supplies relatively well. As for the air tab, if I'm going to be entirely honest, I'm tempted to leave this blank and just put nothing here, much like the helicopter tab and striker cav. But I suppose I could also try and repurpose some aircraft that I previously suggested, such as the F-15 Silent Eagle, the stealthy F-15 variant. There's also things like the A-9, which was the competitor to the YA-9 more accurately, which was the competitor to the YA-10, which became the A-10. The YA-9 could be kind of like the A-10, except fitted with... You see, both prototypes were fitted during the testing stage with an M61 Vulcan where the GAU-8 was supposed to be. So the YA-9 could either still have the M61 Vulcan, or maybe it has a GAU-12, or maybe it has the GAU-8. But I suppose you could put either of those in there. That said, however, if I'm going to be entirely honest, I think I'm more inclined to just leave this tab blank. As for helicopters, there's three primary choices that I could think of. The first would be the UH-72. This would basically act kind of like a combination between the Little Bird and the Black Hawk. It's a relatively light transport helicopter. It can carry maybe 2,000 kilograms worth of supplies. It has just enough space to hold 9 guys, and it's not armed whatsoever. It would just be a light, cheap transport helicopter to move things around. That said, there was an armed version of it developed for one of the programs that the Army launched to try and replace the OH-58 Kiowa. Known as the AAS-72X, or the AAS-72X Plus, this could basically be treated as kind of like, well, the Kiowa, with the overall armament and capabilities likely being the same or at least very similar between the two. Although, if you wanted to separate it from the Kiowa, one thing I suppose you could do is give it the GAU-19B, the 50 caliber miniguns that the Killer Egg gets. Lastly, one option you could have would be the Bell 360 Invictus. This, much like the armed UH-72, was developed for one of the many programs that the Army launched to try and replace the OH-58. Although in the Bell 360's case, I believe it was the latest program that this one was developed for. You can kind of think of this as like a poor man's Comanche. It wouldn't be as stealthy as the Comanche. In fact, it may not be stealthy at all. I don't think the Invictus was designed to be stealthy from the ground up, but it could be kind of like a light attack helicopter. A more attack-oriented than anything like the Killer Egg or the Kiowa or the UH-72, but it's not going to be wiping out entire armored columns the way something like an AH-64D or an AH-64E could. Aside from information about a 20mm rotary cannon, likely similar to that either on the AH-1s or the Comanche itself, I can't find any information about what the Bell 360 was supposed to be armed with. I suspect, however, that it's probably going to be equipped with the semi-active version of the AT Hellfires, and probably rockets, like Hydras, maybe daggers. Again, it would mainly act as like a light attack helicopter. And lastly, there's recon. If I'm going to be entirely honest, I don't really have anything for this. I can't think of any infantry off the top of my head that could be used. I mean, I mentioned the Cougar H as a 2-axle. MRAP transport that could be used for recon infantry. And if I'm going to be entirely honest, I don't think it would be too hard to find some recon infantry, but I don't know any off the top of my head is the problem. The only two things that I can think of that could fit here would be the MQ-20, otherwise known as the General Atomics Avenger, and the RQ-3 Darkstar. The RQ-3 was a program to develop a high-altitude UAV, kind of like the Global Hawk, although I think it would be more akin to something like the MQ-1C, that was launched in the 90s. Ultimately, the program didn't really go anywhere, but the development did ultimately lead to things like the Lockheed Martin Polecat and subsequently the RQ-170. Now, I'm not saying that the Darkstar is going to be stealthy like the RQ-170, but it could be an option for an unarmed UAV in roughly the RQ-170 size range, or more accurately, the RQ-170 vision range as well. Secondly would be the General Atomics Avenger, and this one could be interesting, because it has 6 wing hardpoints and an internal weapons bay. Now, this thing would probably have a lot of options for how you could kit it out. For example, the internal weapons bay, which I think houses like 3,500 pounds, could be used for either a single 2,000 pound precision guided bomb or a number of smaller bombs like Stormbreakers. The 6 hard points on the wings could potentially be used to carry things from Hellfires, maybe have a total of half a dozen Hellfires, or Griffins, you could have potentially up to a dozen of those, or Stingers, or possibly laser guided bombs. The problem is, I don't know what kind of weaponry can go where. Originally, I was under the impression that the hardpoints had different weight limits, but I don't think that's the case. I think I was getting that mixed up with another drone. So potentially, and what I was going to suggest was that you had on the outermost hard points, because you basically have 4 upgrade options: the weapons bay, the inner hard points, the middle hard points, the outer hard points. On the outer hard points, you could go with either a pair of Hellfires or 4 Griffins. And on the middle hard points, you could either go with a pair of Hellfires, 4 Griffins, or 4 Stingers. And then on the inner hard points, you could go with a pair of Hellfires, 4 Griffins, 4 Stingers, or a pair of 500-pound laser-guided bombs. And I suppose you could do that. And the weapons bay, you could house a 1,000-pound or maybe a 2,000-pound bomb. So you could potentially use the thing as a surprisingly heavily armed attack drone, or you could take it without any weapons as a relatively cheap reconnaissance platform. Now, while the General Atomics Avenger was supposed to be stealthy, I don't really think that would translate in game, at least not in the same way as the RQ-170. Anyway, that's about what I have for this specialization. There are holes, most certainly. I mean, I just got done talking about the recon tab and how that has holes. And if I'm going to be entirely honest, I'm inclined to leave air at home. That said, I can certainly see the use for having the air tab. As for the point allocation, there's 2 basic ways that I could see the points being allocated in the specialization, depending on whether or not you would have an air tab or not. I'll probably put up text breaking down the different point allocations for each tab. Overall, though, I think it could work, and honestly, I think it would be fun to have an infantry-focused specialization along with very heavy artillery and some not exactly numerous, but at least novel vehicles. As for recon, as I just said, I'm honestly not too worried about that, but that would need to be filled out. But I don't think it would be hard to find the appropriate recon infantry and maybe even a sniper team. Anyway, that's both of the US specializations. Lastly, that just leaves the Russian one.